Alright, hello everyone, welcome back to another mini review video. I'm gonna keep these quite brief. I know I say that every time, but originally I was planning to actually give some of these albums a few more listens than I usually do and actually, look into them a little bit more and say a little bit more. And then I got sick, and I've been working and going to school and, basically just I realized I really want to get back on track to somewhat of a schedule, so for now these are a lot more brief than I was planning. I do still have some things to say though, and yeah, let's get the reviews started. As always, everything I say here, just my personal opinion. If I say anything negative, it's not me trying to send hate toward anyone or anything like that, just me saying how I personally feel about these albums. Anyway, let's get the review started with... Okay, first, one more thing I want to mention. I mentioned being sick, and I'm still sort of getting over whatever it is that I caught, so if my voice sounds a little different today, that's why. And also, I know this is very clearly scripted. I mean, my reviews are usually scripted, but you can see I'm, reading it really closely and kind of messing up some of the phrasing and the ways I'm trying to say things. Yeah, I'll try to avoid that for future videos, but for today, I was just I'm so far behind where I want to be with everything, so I'm just going to try to get this out ASAP. Just wanted to mention that, but anyway, starting the reviews. Alright, so I'm going to keep this one brief because I didn't really listen to it much, so take this especially with a grain of salt, but after a few listens, I just don't really think it's my cup of tea. Yeah, it's quite experimental, but not really in a way that feels all that unique or interesting, and it's not like there are a lot of strong melodies in my opinion, although there are exceptions such as Paris Syndrome, which does have better melodies, and I do really like the production on that track, and I sort of feel similarly about Smell Good to Be Okay, and I also like the optimism of Bigger Plot, and overall I think the mixing on this album is pretty good, but it's just really forgettable for me overall. Again, I didn't listen to this much, and I didn't even look into the lyrics very closely, but even if I had done both of those things, I probably wouldn't remember this much. I just don't really think it's my cup of tea, so I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Still might be worth a shot. It is at least short, but I've heard much better experimental music, even just this year. So I'd heard of NAHreally before this came out, but I didn't really know much about him. And he has other albums, but this is the only one that I've listened to so far, and I was immediately impressed by his rapping. He's got such a straightforward delivery on this album where the way he says things makes it feel like a cross between regular rapping and just someone saying random things that they're thinking of. And honestly, I think he does a great job of not falling into an awkward in-between where both of those things are compromised, but instead making this work as either. And even in the parts of the album that don't sound like regular talking, it still kind of has that same feeling. And I think that's a really crucial part of what makes this album so interesting, because his delivery really helps emphasize the laid-back, sort of carefree, but also very thoughtful lyrics, which are unlike most other rappers. And, look, I'm well past my days of believing that I can understand every line of a hip-hop album without some serious research, which I'm not even sure I have the time for. At least it's not how I use my time. And, yeah, so I'm sure there is a lot here that I'm missing, but there is a lot of both relatability and also not really showing how distinct he is from everyone else, and telling personal stories with just the right amount of detail where you wonder if there's more that he's not saying. And I really like the endless potential meanings of the Pancake storyline throughout the album as well that occurs at the end of each track. And when it comes to the instrumentals and production, well, the latter is really strong, including the mixing, which leaves basically no issues in my opinion and really helps you focus on what NAHreally is saying, or just vibe out to it if that's what you'd rather do. And I think it really drives forward that feeling that sometimes vibes and thoughtfulness go hand in hand, and sometimes can even be the same in certain ways. Now, don't take all of what I'm saying here to be some sort of, don't take what I'm saying to be some sort of mindset that turning your mind off and just relaxing and not worrying about anything is always the solution to everything, because it's not. But I do like the balance here between thoughtfulness and just making laid-back hip-hop music that just feels really good to listen to. So yeah, this is an excellent hip-hop album and one of the first great albums of 2025 that I've heard. I really don't have a whole lot of complaints about it outside of a few things which I'll mention. Maybe the fact that it could have been a little bit longer and produced more complete songs rather than what kind of just feel like demos a little bit considering the length. But look, it also does kind of feel like it works for this album, where a lot of it is just about having a good time and not overthinking everything and not putting in more effort than you need to, which is exactly what I'm doing in this video. But anyway, on the topic of complaints though, I don't love the guest features, and I don't know why Michi718 decided to dead name Muhammad Ali on Sims, which isn't one of the better tracks here anyway. But still, aside from those few things, I don't really have any major complaints. So for me, it's a 9 out of 10, and based on my rating system, I do use half points. So that doesn't mean this is going to be among the very best of 2025 that I hear, but we're early enough in the year that it's easily one of the biggest standouts I've listened to this year, and I'm going to have to keep an eye out for future releases from this guy and maybe check out some of his other albums soon too. I didn't really know what to expect going into this, but I'm really glad I discovered it, and it's a sort of chill, fun, and in many ways oddly relatable album that I didn't know I needed in 2025. It might not be for everyone, but this certainly impressed me, and I'm thrilled to find this. This is the sophomore studio album from electronic artist Ela Minus, following a 2020 debut that I skipped over, but I was still curious to hear this after seeing some of the genre descriptions. And I was pleasantly surprised by the way the opening track progresses and becomes a slow burner, which kicks off the album really well. And then the second track sounds almost like a more electronic version of U2's Where the Streets Have No Name, and while of course it's not better than that track, that's pretty hard to do, this was still pulled off better than I was expecting, and it's pretty close to being a great song in my opinion. So at this point, on my third listen to the album, I was very intrigued after listening to this in the background a few times before and not really being super impressed. But then we get the third track, Idols, which has way clunkier percussion and not nearly as gripping a vocal performance as the previous track. And from this point on, I sort of realized this just wasn't going to click for me as a whole, especially because beyond the first two tracks, it just didn't have a lot to offer for me. The production choices are the sort of thing where I can see how it works, but I personally don't really like it. Yeah, it's very jumpy, and that often contributes to a dancier vibe, but something about the contrast of this style, along with the actual songs that are written here, just doesn't totally feel like a fit, if you ask me. So overall, I'm just not all that impressed by this. I mean, it's probably better than I'm giving it credit for, but after a few listens, I feel comfortable saying this is not for me. I'll give it a 6 out of 10, and I'd still recommend checking it out if you haven't yet, but I'm not going to be revisiting this much. I guess time will tell if any of the individual songs stand out to me. As of right now, there are a few I really like, but as a whole, I think this is far from great, at least in my personal music taste. So I don't really know much about Rose Grey, but this new album has been getting some attention as of late, and considering I saw it's a dance album, I was certainly interested, as I can totally get behind dance music at its best, and the reception to this seemed to be mostly positive. But I also had a bit of a weird feeling going into this that told me it wasn't really going to be great, and it's probably because while the reception has been generally positive, it hasn't been completely drowned in positive reviews, and considering how much attention it's gotten, I was a little put off by the lack of agreement. And on my first few listens, I did not get it at all. There's a lot of pitch shifting and chopped vocals and other elements that can be really annoying when overused or used in the wrong context, and I think one reason why artists often use these tactics is because the repetition makes the songs easier to remember and thus often more popular. Now, as far as I know, Rose Grey is far from a mainstream artist, but that doesn't mean her music gets a pass for those elements I would criticize in mainstream music, especially considering how try-hard so much music out there is as an attempt to appeal to the masses, even when realistically there's basically no shot at that happening. And yeah, to some extent, I do think this was probably in large part an attempt to appeal to a wide audience and possibly become more successful than it's most likely going to be, although you never know, she does have a fairly big audience. But I'm not entirely sure that that attempted accessibility is to this album's detriment. I mean, at the end of the day, this is a dance record, but it's also in a lot of ways a pop record, as it has mostly typical verse-chorus structures and the kind of melodies and hooks that are sticky and make for a pretty danceable album. I definitely would not avoid this if I were a club DJ. Now, with that being said, I am left wondering how memorable this is going to be, and even if it is, it will definitely be tainted for me by the feeling that this could have really popped off a lot more. Because look, when you start to get to some of the clumsier hooks, such as Switch and Tectonic, you start to realize, or at least I did, that this album feels a lot more like a moment in time than a future classic, and I feel pretty safe saying that. And I think a big part of it is that when the vibes are hitting the right sweet spot for me, there is often just something that feels a little bit off about it. Look at Angel of Satisfaction, for example, where the repetition of bay, 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 bay has the right sound to it to make for a club anthem, but the lack of an interesting melody or performance does feel very glaring and really holds back a song that could have been a great dance song, but instead just leaves me feeling really underwhelmed. And I think one of the biggest signs that an album isn't hitting as hard as I feel like it should is very present here, and that even my favorite song in the album feels like another reminder of an issue I have with the album as a whole. And here it's because Party People feels like a song that completely prioritizes the vibe over writing with the unique hook, which in the case of that track sounds either like a Shy Girl song, which I don't really mind as I think Shy Girl is a decent artist based on what I've heard of her music, or much worse, a bland, generic early 2010s club hit, and I actually think it works better than it probably should. So look, I don't think Louder Please is a bad album, but it's one that I'm with mixed feelings on, where a lot of the aspects that I like also contrastingly detract from it in other ways. I do still think this is a mostly good dance pop album. I certainly don't think it falls completely flat on its face, but I also feel like it's probably going to get praised by a lot of people as a great album, and I personally don't think it is. Now I will say, it is one that I wanted to go in more detail on. I just never got around to it and wanted to get this out sooner than later, but for me it's a 7 out of 10. I can certainly recognize some of the things that it does well, but I just wish it popped off a little harder. It is what it is. I found out about this album because of the YouTuber Spectrum Pulse, who I've talked about before on Simon Talks Music, one of my favorite music reviewers on YouTube, and watching his reviews leads me to find so much great music, including that NAHreally album, which I just talked about. I watched his review of this album, and he said it was great, so I was very excited to hear it. And it's a mostly instrumental IDM album that does have a nice amount of variety, from the more mellow tracks to some slightly dancier tunes, to some more experimental tracks like Dangerous Curve. And yeah, there's a lot to really like about this album. I like the shuffling percussion with the bass on Unhealthy for Sensitive Groups. The Natural Path has what sounds like a xylophone or something, and I really like that about it. And the main melodic keyboard on Hydrologic Outlook adds a nice touch. And those aren't even my favorite tracks here. But with all that being said, I don't really expect to be going back to this much. With albums like this, it's usually more about the whole album experience rather than individual tracks, and this nearly hour-long project just feels too inconsistent to fully click for me. But I can still recommend this to fans of instrumental dance music. I mostly like it, which is why I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10, but I just didn't quite love it. So going into this album, I decided to listen to all of the Weather Station's other albums at least a few times each, and after doing so, I can definitely say my favorite albums of theirs so far are Ignorance and The Line. Although I didn't really love their 2022 album, and that was the most recent release of theirs before this album came out, or at least full album release. I'm not actually sure if they've put out anything else since then. But I was hearing good things about this album, and on my first few listens I was quite intrigued by the sound, with so many great melodies, and the strings that add so much wonderful texture, and the drums that sound great in the mix. But I also think this brings a lot to the table lyrically. Whereas previously the Weather Station have written quite a bit about climate change, this is much more of a personal album, although climate change is absolutely still a topic on this album, especially on the track Irreversible Damage. And it's often about how this relates to one's personal journey, with one example in my opinion being the title track, which tries to be optimistic but struggles to do so. But there are some more optimistic moments on this album, like the closing track Sewing, which seems to be about trying to make the most of what we do have, even when so much has been lost. And the poetry here is really beautiful. And again, when this album sounds so gorgeous with the beautiful production and some of Tamara Lindemann's best vocals, oh, and don't even get me started on Neon Signs, which is easily one of my favorite songs of 2025, and I'm sure I'll have more to say about it later. Well, I started to realize that this album is absolutely phenomenal, and it probably deserves more attention than I'm giving it. It's the kind of album that's so excellent I would normally give it its own individual review. But look, it's early in the year, and I'm still trying to figure out how and when I'm going to post my year-end lists for 2024. I was not prepared for a 9.5 out of 10 album here, but I think I'm going to have to give it that score because this completely blew my mind, and it might be the Weather Station's best album thus far. And look, I decided to keep this as a mini review because, like I said, I'm barely keeping up with my review schedule. I know this is super rushed. I've got more individual reviews coming out, and I just decided I may as well just throw this into this video because that's what I was planning to do. But yeah, terrific album. I'm glad I finally decided to listen to it. I finally decided to listen to this band. Yeah, I highly recommend this. I'll be honest and say that I have no idea who Kit Le Bien is, but I came across this album online when I was looking at new releases and first decided to check out Kit Le Bien's 2023 album, The Cities We Build, which I mostly liked, but I already don't remember much of it, and it didn't completely wow me. Anyway, here we have a very diverse album stylistically, although most of it is pretty mellow and just has a large amount of experimentation. And if you're into artists like Jane Remover or Lost Cats, the latter of which I just reviewed recently, this very well could be up your alley. Now look, there are some interesting lyrical ideas on quite a few of these tracks. It does feel a little bit abstract in a way that's supposed to be hard to figure out, or maybe where you're just supposed to give it your own meaning. But I kind of read Sharp Teeth as an anthem for being yourself specifically for yourself, and how difficult but also rewarding that can be. And there's also the title track that feels like someone's worst fears getting the best of them, and getting in the way of living a normal life, and it's quite haunting. And there's also Decomposing, which I read as a very bleak and vivid description of someone having a mental breakdown, and it's one of the biggest standout tracks lyrically for me. And Your Voice is a very uniquely optimistic song as far as I can tell, where the bleakness and sadness is absolutely there, but won't win out in the end. But that's continued onto the closing track as well, even though it almost felt like it was being set up for disaster within whatever fragments of a story there is here. And honestly, I think the ending of this album does fit quite well with the contrast of chilly, wintry vibes and bright sounds, both of which are all over this album basically start to finish. And unfortunately, beyond that, I don't really vibe with this album much. Yeah, I think it's mostly well produced, even though in some moments the higher frequencies can get kind of tinny and distracting. And there is a nice variety in sound, and I don't think the mixing leaves much to be desired. But the biggest thing that holds this album back for me is the vocals. Yeah, I think it's done as an artistic choice, but it often sounds kind of off-pitch, and it's just not very pleasant to listen to in my opinion. And maybe it's not even off-pitch, I'm not sure, but it just sounds kind of whiny and half-assed, and I feel bad saying this, but I just can't help but feel this way. And yes, I know I'm completely half-assing these reviews, but again, I never claimed not to be hypocritical. Of course, that doesn't help that it doesn't help that I don't find the melodies all that strong, and there isn't really much to the song structures that pulls me toward it. I don't know, maybe this is just the perfect example of an album that's not for me. It's not a bad album, but especially considering it runs for over an hour, and so little of it is really going to stick with me, I think I'm just going to have to give it a 6 out of 10. I did really like Your Voice, a nice late album surprise that actually picks up way more energy and basically goes into full-on synth pop with traces of rock too. But as a whole, this is very mediocre to me. Might click a lot more for you, but I couldn't really get into it. I'll be honest and say that I've never fully been able to get into FKA Twigs whenever I've listened to her music. Yeah, maybe I just haven't listened enough, but I did revisit both LP1 and Magdalene recently for the first time in a while. The former I definitely heard multiple times before. The latter I may not have listened to until recently, I can't remember. But I can't really say either of them did a whole lot for me. I mean, I generally like them, but I didn't really love either of them. And considering 2022's Capra Songs is technically a mixtape and also didn't get super positive reviews, I just decided to skip over that one and go right into Eusexua. And wow, this is a mixed bag. And it's one of those albums where even in a mini review, I think the best way for me to talk about it is just go through some of the individual tracks in the order that they appear, although I'm not going to mention all 11 tracks, rather just the ones that really give me something to say. So after a mostly uninteresting opening track, we get Girl Feels Good, one of my favorite tracks in the album with a really great groove and a great melodic chorus. And I actually quite like the vocal effects that make for a dance song that feels way more lightweight than the genuinely thoughtful lyrics would imply, without taking away from the emphasis of said lyrics, which have a good message combining feminism as well as hope for straight single men that that when they find the woman who's right for them, to make the most of that opportunity, as long as it's what she wants too. And I also quite like the next track, Perfect Stranger, which reminds me a little bit of both Lorde and Charlie XCX in the vocal delivery, especially the latter. And while I could understand why a song like this might be obnoxiously melodramatic to some, I actually find it kind of cute, describing an infatuation for someone you know nothing about because you know nothing about them. And this track is really well produced too. But what the fuck happened on Drums of Death? The production sounds choppy as fuck. The chopped vocal section has absolutely no impact other than feeling like headache fuel, and none of it comes together to create any sort of cohesion. And yeah, I know it's experimental pop, but it sounds almost like a really bad Chainsmokers song or something. I don't know, that's probably not a good comparison, but it definitely reminds me of something. Whatever it is, of course, because this is FKA Twigs, people are going to say it's great experimental pop, but in my opinion, this sucks. Next, there's Room of Fools, which has some of the most annoying synthesizers on the album, and a very annoying drum beat that has absolutely no power. And while I like this track more than the previous one, it is still quite obnoxious. And I think the only other track I really want to mention is Striptease, which I think is mostly mediocre, but at least it's somewhat interesting in the way it sounds like an attempt to make an early Halsey song. And I don't think the production is atmospheric enough for it to really work, and FKA Twigs certainly does not give her best vocal performance on this track. But hey, at least it was interesting. So yeah, I know this is an unpopular opinion, but I really don't think this album is very good. Yeah, it's got its moments, but it's just not a consistent enough project for me to call it great, and honestly, the vast majority of it just doesn't leave much of an impact on me at all. So I'm gonna have to give this a strong 5 out of 10. I was considering going with a 5.5, but I really just didn't like it that much as a whole. You can get mad at me all you want. I know this is getting a ton of acclaim, but this just struck a really odd chord for me. I don't know, it's just not working. I've noticed more in recent years that I'm not really huge on metalcore as a genre. Yeah, like most genres, I can like it, but I feel like it's a lot more often that I'll hear a metalcore album that I don't really find all that interesting or maybe even dislike. But this is a very short project, and the reviews were mostly positive, so I thought I may as well give it a shot. And like a lot of these reviews, I'm going to keep this one brief, but it's not a good sign when one of my first observations is that it reminds me of Falling in Reverse. Now, before I go any further, no, this is not as bad as that most recent Falling in Reverse album, and part of that is because the guitars actually bring a little more melodic support, but it's also mostly because it doesn't feature Ronnie Radke complaining about cancel culture as a cover-up for his shitty actions. But aside from those two things, a lot of this does feel very reminiscent, especially in some of the dynamics and the sort of jumpy feeling of the drums and guitar, and the vocal style does remind me a little bit of Ronnie Radke. And lyrically, it does remind me a bit of them too, except not super problematic. And speaking of which, it's another one of those albums where I can recognize that the lyrics are about depression, or at least I think they are. And I don't want to be insensitive or anything, but a lot of it does feel cliche. And if this is what the band felt they needed to make, that's great for them. And if it resonates with people, I'm not trying to ruin this album for anyone, but it's just not really for me. And I haven't even mentioned the title track, in which the screamed vocals are combined with mellow instrumentation, and I don't think it works at all. Again, this might in large part just be a genre thing, as I'm not really huge on metalcore. But even then, I can admit that I like some of the guitar work in the opening track, and the way that the tension builds in More Than a Witness, and I do like some other metalcore. In fact, sometimes it can be some of my favorite music. So yeah, I just don't really think this is essential listening for metalcore fans. Yeah, you'll probably like it more than me, but I don't think that really says much considering I'm giving this a 4 out of 10. I didn't have the highest expectations going in, but I did still expect better than this. So this is an ambient project that's been getting quite a bit of acclaim, and it's another review that I want to keep very brief for the reasons I mentioned earlier. And, well, it doesn't really give me a whole lot to say anyway. There are some nice instrumental timbres and some moments where the subtler details do shine through a little bit, but the majority of this just didn't leave much of an impact on me. There are some lyrics on this album, I think, but I can't really hear what they are, and I couldn't find them when I looked them up, so I can't comment on that. But overall, as a musical experience, while it feels kind of fitting for a rainy day, which it was when I listened to this, which was actually earlier today, the same day I'm recording this, I do mean that in more of a miserable way, where I'd rather listen to something with a bit more energy to it, or at least a vibe that I like more. I don't know, with this kind of album, it becomes really hard to describe why they do or don't work. Because it's not like the sound quality is bad or anything, it's just that there's something about the overall project that isn't fully clicking for me. Do I find it a little boring? Yeah, there's that. But I also just feel like it's too moody without doing anything all that unique as far as I can tell, to the point where it just becomes a bit much. I mean, at least it's short, and I like some moments such as Lavender NF and Little Window, as well as the slightly brighter sounds of the closing track Mute, so I'll give it a 6 out of 10, but I don't really fully get the hype with this one. If you like it, good for you, but I doubt I'm going to be going back to this. Alright, thanks for watching. I will hopefully have a full-length album review posted fairly soon for the Ethel Cain album, which I was mentioning. I might do a full album review for that new Weekend album. I haven't heard it yet, but considering it's the final Weekend album, I'm pretty sure, probably worth giving it a full review. I'm curious to hear it, but anyway, with all that being said, yeah, I'll try to put more effort into the next one of these mini review videos. I've realized, like, I always end up finishing these videos going, I wish I'd put more effort in, but, like, I can't at the end of the day. Like, I have been trying to review a lot of albums, and, you know, only time will tell if I really like this format, or if I'd like to just start reviewing less albums and maybe putting in a little bit more time and energy into those. But with the number of albums I review, like, it's basically impossible to actually go fully in depth with all of them. But with that being said, I do want to, you know, do a little better than this. I know this video, even compared to my other videos, you're probably looking at it, noticing just how much I'm messing up everything I'm trying to say. But anyway, with all that being said, thank you for watching. I'll see you soon.